Jesus has interesting things to say on the topics of human happiness, death, and God. This lecture covers what he says in his famous Sermon on the Mount, which is in the Gospel according to Matthew, the first Gospel in the New Testament. Obviously, this isn't church, this is a philosophy class, so in this lecture I'm not going to make any assumptions about Jesus' status, other than assuming that he was a real person. There are a few people running around now who claim that he never existed, that he's a literary invention. This is a kooky view. We have lots of first century sources within 50, 70 years of his crucifixion, which give us information about him. Some sources uncontroversially from the 50s and the 60s, and he was crucified no later than 36. Millions of Christians worship Jesus as somebody who is both divine and human. Sometimes he is called God in human form, or even the God-man. It's part of standard Catholic Christian teaching that he has two natures, a divine nature and a human nature. It's often believed that he's always existed, that he created the world, and so on. But I'm not going to assume any of those things about Jesus. I'm just going to assume that he was a real Jewish man who lived about 2,000 years ago. He had a real mom. He was really born. I am going to assume that our earliest sources are reasonably accurate about him. That's a little bit controversial, but in my view there's a bit of a double standard here. As I understand him, Jesus has a thoroughly Jewish understanding of human happiness. Still, you might wonder why we're treating Jesus as a philosopher. He wasn't exactly a philosopher. He wasn't a Greek. He wasn't somebody who studied Plato and Aristotle. What he was a religious teacher. He was the sort of person which a little bit later in Jewish history came to be called a rabbi. People followed him around to learn from him and to observe his way of life and to become like him, and he actively encouraged people to be his disciples. So no, not a philosopher in the Greek sense, but I think that Jesus has very interesting views about human happiness, and his particular theory centrally incorporates the topics of God and the afterlife. And as we've seen in previous lectures, a lot of theories about human happiness don't deal in a satisfactory way with the questions of God and afterlife. In my view, his teaching presupposes a fairly detailed and coherent view about human flourishing or human happiness. So I suggest it pays off to take him seriously and to seriously think through what he teaches. See if you agree. There are some barriers to thinking about him. People very often think they already know what he says, and that's whatever they think. They think he was just a nice person, but not particularly smart. I think that's a mistake. So let's read through the brief passage. You'll recognize several phrases from this which have entered into popular language. Now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. We'll come back to this passage in a minute. In my view, this passage is very often misunderstood, and people don't interpret it in a coherent way. But before we get to that, I want to teach you a little bit of philosopher's lingo about necessary and sufficient conditions. If we say that some condition A is necessary for a condition B, what we're saying is the condition B cannot occur without A being present. Let's suppose that A is being female. That condition is necessary for being someone's mother. It's not sufficient. Being female, of course, doesn't guarantee that you're anybody's mother. But what this is saying is that that condition, being somebody's mother, cannot occur without that person being female. Another example would be having healthy lungs. That is necessary for being a good marathon runner. You can't be a good marathon runner without having healthy lungs. The theories that we looked at earlier in this series of lectures, we saw that for Aristotle, being good is necessary for being happy. There are a lot of other things that are necessary for being happy, but one of the things that's necessary is being a good person. Another example would be for Aristotle, living an active life is necessary for being happy. We can also talk about sufficient conditions. This is some condition which by itself guarantees that some other condition holds. Thus, being born in Paris is sufficient for being born in France. If you were born in Paris, that by itself guarantees that you were born in France. That condition is not necessary for being born in France. There are many other places you might have been born in, each of which would be sufficient for your being French or born in France, none of which is necessary. If somebody put you into a meat grinder, that would be sufficient for your being dead. It's not necessary for your being dead. There are many other ways you could die. You could be exploded by a bomb, you could be thrown down a well, you could be fed poisoned burritos. Each one of those would be sufficient for your being dead. None of them would be necessary for your being dead. As an example of this, Glaucon argued that doing whatever you want while having a reputation for being good is sufficient for being happy. Of course, it was also necessary. And that brings us to the next point, which is that a condition can be both necessary and sufficient for another condition. If the second condition is being a bachelor, it would be necessary to being a bachelor that you are an adult, unmarried male, human. Each one of those conditions individually is necessary for being a bachelor, but all of them together are both necessary and sufficient for being a bachelor. So they're sufficient because they guarantee that you're a bachelor, and they're necessary because you can't be a bachelor without being in these following four conditions. As an example of this, we saw that Plato held that being virtuous, being a good person, is both necessary and sufficient for being well off, that is, for being happy. In the next segment of this lecture, we'll look at competing interpretations of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount.